have three panelists today, and we have a moderator. And our moderator is Dean Mary Elizabeth Moore. She is the Dean of School of Theology. And without further ado, I want to ask her to introduce our panelists.
We are so fortunate this afternoon to have these three panelists. These are not only outstanding leaders of the church, but they are also people who have mentored leaders for many, many years. So they have wisdom beyond wisdom in every cell. I'll introduce them briefly because they will be sharing something of their stories as they share their wisdom about leadership this afternoon. And then we're going to have, after the three presentations, I'm going to ask them some questions, spontaneous questions. They don't know what they are yet. And then we're going to throw it out to you. And you may notice that I'll pick up a bowl of flowers and put it here if they go past the time that they themselves have set. So if you see the flowers, you'll know that they have set that time and they've requested that kind of reminder because they want to leave time for us to have discussion with everybody. Karen Greenwald is very recently retired as the General Secretary of the General Board of Discipleship of the United Methodist Church. I remember when she was first elected to that position, and in one of her very first meetings, people in the gathering were sharing their enormous, unreasonable expectations for her leadership. They thought she was going to make these amazing changes in the General Board of Discipleship. What you need to know is that she lived up to those expectations. She had previously been Associate General Secretary of the same board, and she had, before that, been Director of Church Leader Development and also had worked in education and ministries with young adults and single adults. Prior to that time, coming from Texas as she did, she had been Associate Director for the Council of the Central Texas United Methodist Church, Central Texas Conference of the United Methodist Church, and prior to that she had served in pastoral roles. She's had vast experience. She knows the church inside and out. She has heard many, many voices. Her wisdom is hers and it is shared by many others. Jane Allen Middleton is a retired bishop of the United Methodist Church, and she has most recently been serving as the bishop in the Susquehanna Annual Conference, which is located in central Pennsylvania. Before she was elected in 2004, she was serving as district superintendent in the Connecticut-New York district, and that's kind of interesting. How one district can cover the two states. But prior to that, she served as a pastor, and she has, as you can read in your file, she has served in many spiritual mentoring roles, retreat leader, and in many other ways. And in her own annual conference service as bishop, she was especially good at mentoring churches into growth and mentoring clergy into their own leadership potential. So she has had much experience in leadership in the church, and any of you who are at General Conference knows that she's also a brilliant preacher. Finally, Susan Hassinger, who many of you already know, is a bishop in residence and lecturer in spirituality and leadership here at the School of Theology. She's co-director also of their Religion and Conflict Transformation program. And she was an active bishop from 1996 to 2004, but because we couldn't do without her leadership, she kept coming back and serving interim roles. The most recent role was helping 3 annual conferences. Was it 3 or 2?
It was ultimately 6
in all.
Helping a lot of annual conferences into one, which is now the Upper New York Annual Conference. What I'd also like to say about Susan is that she is a spiritual director. She is a teacher extraordinaire, and many of us know her as a person in our midst who has touched our lives and changed the way we live. Enough said. The 3 of them will now speak for themselves.
As a 5 or 6 year old Brownie Scout, my troop had a talent show. And so I got up very dutifully and played a piece on the piano. And I confess I royally messed up. I remember as this young kid getting up off of the piano bench, turning around to the other Brownie Scouts and the adults who were in the room, and I apologized for making such a mess of it. The Brownie Scout troop leader immediately jumped to her feet, and she came to me and she said this: "Never apologize when you do your best." Now I want you to turn around, sit back down on that piano bench, and play that piece of music that you know, and do your best. And when you finish, get up, turn around, smile, and sit down. Well, dutiful 5 or 6 year old that I was, I did that. And her instruction was absolutely instrumental in learning about leadership from the various earliest moments of my memory. Her "do your best" is one of the principles from which I have spent my life leading in the church. It was a positive instruction. She believed that I could do better and that I did not need to apologize when I did my best. She provided me a way to actually improve and to do better. And after she told me to do that and I followed her instructions, she then smiled, and every time I saw her after that, she said, "Are you doing your best?" Powerful instruction in a small incident in my early life. Through the years, leadership roles and leadership responsibilities have come my way. Not necessarily because I wanted them, but they've just come my way. I was in major parts in school plays. I was elected as the youth leader in my local churches. I was elected in all kinds of positions in college. And when I decided to move through the ordination process and was appointed to my first few positions, I really suddenly realized that I didn't know enough about leadership, about how it was to be a woman as a leader in the church. And while I recognized that I had natural talents and abilities, obviously, because peers and others kept calling me forward to be in leadership, I didn't know enough. And I recognized that if I were going to make it in ministry, I had to learn everything I could learn about leadership. And so over all of these years, now 39 years of ministry, I have sought to learn as much as I could about the function, the responsibility, and how to be an effective leader. I sought out books. I sought out classes and mentors who could help me learn about how to be a better leader. There were, of course, the requisite workshops that I took, classes offered by the church, particularly instructive, and you would know this, Dean Ward, the Christian Education Laboratory process, which no longer exists, unfortunately, in the church, was absolutely instrumental in teaching me how to be a leader in the church. I took all kinds of classes in the church, and I also took classes in the larger cultural society, the leadership for executive leaders, in particularly the American Management Association, and was certified in that process in corporate and business principles, how to lead organizations of small size or large size, for profit or for not for profit. Books and articles provided all kinds of information and all kinds of instruction to me about how to be a leader. There were particularly 4 of those that were the most important. Now you'll note that I was going into leadership back in the 1970s and 1980s. And so the most important book that I read early on, probably in I'm not exactly sure when I read it, but it was called The Games My Mother Never Taught You. One of the best books about how to be a woman in leadership in the world. There are games that are played that we as women know nothing about. And in fact, it was the most instrumental book that I've ever read in my life about how you play the game of leadership by learning the culture of leadership from a male perspective. Games my mother never taught you. And the subtitle is Corporate Gamesmanship for Women. Another was Women's Reality, an emerging female system, which was instrumental in helping me understand how it is that women come to leadership in very different kinds of ways than do men, and how women learn differently from ways that men learn. That book has been instrumental across the years on how to shape educational settings, how to shape business, organizational meetings, etc., so that men and women are given access equally to think, to imagine, to dream, to plan, and to do. Leadership in the New Science, Discovering Order in a Chaotic World by Margaret Wheatley is an absolute must-read book, in my opinion. It teaches us about how organic systems organize themselves around identity, communication, and relationships, rather than procedures, policies, and practices. Usually what we do in the church is go after the policies, the procedures, practices. In the United Methodist Church, we go out about how to fix the Book of Discipline. Well, if you read Margaret Wheatley and you take her words seriously, we completely miss the point when we do that. Organizing systems, organized from organic structures. And when they do that, they pay attention to identity, communication, and relationships. The practices, the policies, the procedures follow in place as needed and are created from the larger frame of identity, i.e. purpose, i.e. vision. A fourth book, The Art of Possibility, Transforming Professional and Personal Life by Rosamund Stone Zander and Benjamin Zander. An absolutely stellar book around how it is that all persons can lead, and all persons who lead from the art of possibility are not drawn into negative, downward, what they call downward spiral conversation. If you think about most conversations in the church, they go like this, and then they go like this. But as the Zanders say, whenever they're going like this, they're still part of the same system, downward spiral conversation, where no one wins. Everybody loses, even though there may be a particular winner. We as an organization, the church, had actually lost. I watched exceptional people, women and men, whose abilities provided excellent examples about how to lead, and followed their advice, their mentorship, some of them formal mentors and some of them not. Finally, and most importantly, I never doubted for a single moment that I could lead. I never doubted that I didn't have the ability to lead, somehow inherently. And maybe it's because I was born and raised in Texas, where you have this inculcating cultural expression that leads itself to creating people who believe they can. I never believed that I could not. And so over the years, I have led, whether internally I felt like a leader or not. I presented myself as a person who had the right to be there, the right to lead, and so I have. Now, that often has taken the form of squaring my shoulders, taking the most deep breath I know how to take, and just marching into a position or place where other people didn't think I should be. I believed I should be there. And what I would say to you is, if you have that sense that you have the right to be there, no one can take that away from you. Someone has said anyone can lead from anywhere, and I believe that's absolutely true. Some are given the authority to lead by organizations. Others lead just naturally and importantly are able to do so. And the most important word I would say to you is this. Are there power dynamics at work? Absolutely there are. And I'm going to finish in a very short little bit. Are there power dynamics at work? Absolutely there are. And we must pay attention to them. What I would say to you is, from the perspective of the first woman ordained in my annual conference as a deacon and as an elder. I chose not to be put in either camp of the raging feminist leader. Now you have to think 1975. I chose not to be in that camp, and I chose not to be in the submissive camp of, well, the guys will just take care of you. I watched those women over the years become angry, ineffective, and inefficient leaders. I chose a middle ground which said that I choose to serve the vision of God for the people of God in this world. And sometimes that means that we can break the structures of power effectively, and sometimes we can't. And when we can't, we do what I believe also to be true, is that we lead to a different way, through a different process, believing that there is not just one right answer. There are multiple right answers. And if we are following the lead of God, we can lead. We can change the world. And so I have chosen to lead where? With allies towards God's vision, and to learn along the way, always learning how to be a better leader, and at the end of the day, asking again, where am I trying to go? Toward God's vision, believing that all things work together for good for those who love God and who live according to God's purposes.
I'm glad you moved that flower. I was feeling a little intimidated by that. What I want to do today is to talk about principles. We heard about those from one of our earlier presenters, and these are some principles that I find I have lived out of. The first principle of power, and we've heard about this before too, has to be connected with God. The first principle has to be getting grounded in where I believe God is calling me. You might say, well, duh, what else are you going to do? But I found in my own life, sometimes that's the last question I go to. I head down a path and suddenly realize, wait a minute, where is it that God is calling me in this setting? And I've felt it's important for me to bring that question up in any group, organization, anything I've been a part of, to constantly ask that question, what is God's yearning for us? What is it that God is calling us to do? How is God directing or guiding or offering to us possibilities for our future together? So the first principle of power is discerning God's yearning individually and in leading others. The second principle is that power comes through empowering others. In 1979, I was appointed to, I had been an associate pastor, and I was appointed as the pastor in charge of a church in Connecticut. And it was my first Sunday. Getting there had not been an easy challenge, easy thing, and we could go into that too. How is it that you become the first woman in a church? And we heard stories of that earlier this afternoon. First, I think it was about 125 years for this church, so they didn't have quite as long a history as the one that we heard Young describe. But they weren't happy about having a woman, and furthermore, I had instructed the choir to be prepared to do a processional, which they had not done. They were accustomed to slipping into the chancel from the choir room, and this meant they had to walk through the sanctuary or down to the fellowship hall and back up to the entry to the church in order to do this processional. That was probably only one of the reasons they were unhappy about it. So I gathered the choir for prayer prior to my first Sunday, meeting most of them for the first time. And Jess, who seemed to be 6'2", he might have only been 6 feet or 5'10", I don't know. Anyway, I was looking up at him. And Jess's day job was doing union organizing, rather contracts against the union for Union Carbide. So he was a tough guy. So Jess looked down at me and said to me, "Are you going to follow us or are you going to lead us?" And I said, "I'm going to walk behind you and push." And that's what Jess did too. He just threw his head back and he roared. And it was a flippant remark in a way, and yet it is kind of a paradigm for what I think leadership is. It's walking behind people and pushing. It's sometimes walking beside them and being their companion. Sometimes it's walking out ahead. But it is empowering people to use their gifts for ministry. That's what the second principle I'm identifying is in leadership. Helping people to identify what their gifts are and encouraging them and mentoring them and guiding them and sometimes pulling them and persuading them. But in every way, helping the church to come alive as people whose gifts are being used for God. So the third, that's the second principle. The third principle is to claim your power. To claim your power. We heard that from Young in a marvelous way earlier about how she, in a very hostile environment, has claimed the authority that God has given her. There are many times when women particularly are like other marginalized groups, dominated. The domination group will marginalize us. That's only one of the issues. Sometimes other women will marginalize us. There are settings in which no one will give us authority, and therefore we must turn to that inner authority, to the authority that I believe is God-given. We've also had the experience of putting forth an idea and hearing it batted around or not even acknowledged. And 30 minutes later, 45 minutes later, one of the dominant group will mention that idea and suddenly, well, that's a brilliant idea.
It was brilliant when I said that.
But another way to refer to this is personal power, or I would say even God-given power. Call upon your inner strength. Others won't grant you power. It won't be earned. It is unearned, but you can claim it. The fourth principle is, if you are blessed with conferred authority, use it. And what I want to point out is, there is authority that you must claim, inner authority. There is also such a thing as conferred authority. When women first began to be appointed as district superintendents in the United Methodist Church, I noticed they changed. There was an air of confidence about them that I observed they hadn't necessarily had before. And what I concluded from that it is a subtle change, but it is observable, that there is such a thing as conferred authority. The same phenomenon must happen to CEOs and to school principals, to senators, conference ministers, general secretaries, maybe even to bishops. But other women in positions which by virtue of a particular role are given commonly agreed upon or conferred power. And it's important to use that, use it for good if that's given to you. The fifth principle is that information is power. Before any encounter, do your homework. Be aware of the issues that may come up. One of the things I did as a United Methodist when it was, as we were saying earlier in our conversation, when it was mostly me and the boys at every meeting I attended, was I would come with the United Methodist Book of Discipline, and I would come with the conference journal. And just having those two things in those meetings often made me the person, the go-to person, to be able to provide some answers as we dialogue. So, but there are other ways to be sure you've prepared yourself for the kind of work you have to do, whatever that might be as a leader. And there's another principle, and I don't know quite how to phrase this, but I think it's very important, and that is look like a leader. To show up with a slovenly appearance, papers all over the place, will not give you the respect of the persons in that group, whether they should respect you or not. And so it's important to look like a leader. And so those are my offerings today. 6 principles. There are many, many more. But 1, power begins with discerning God's yearning. 2, empowering others brings power. 3, use innate power by claiming your inner authority. 4, when you've been given it, use conferred power. 5, information is power. And 6, look the power that you are.
I just passed glasses back.
Thank you so much.
I couldn't be up here without mine. It is such a privilege to be in this panel with 2 colleagues, friends who I have admired and learned from across the years. I will be sharing some of similar themes, but from a couple of different angles in this time. I'm going to start with an illustration. It was July of 1996 when the jurisdictional conference met in Western Massachusetts at the University of Massachusetts. There were 4 new bishops to be elected to replace 4 retiring bishops. This is done in sequential fashion. The first one elected, Alfred Johnson, was from my home conference, Eastern Pennsylvania. And I was in the mix of multiple candidates. And after that election, I went to congratulate Alfred, my colleague, and didn't think much more when somebody came up to me and said, I think you should withdraw from this process. I don't think that you have the gifts, the capabilities, the style of being a good bishop.
Wow.
Well, you know what? I could have agreed with that person. Because I am not a typical style, I don't think. And there were many reasons why I didn't fit the particular mold. But that comment sparked within me something some former colleagues over here are nodding. That it was as though I heard a voice. Oh, yes, you can do it. I will be with you. Just wait and see what the process brings. Don't withdraw now. That sense of a call from God, that sense of purpose has remained with me across 18 years. Shortly after that lunch break, I was elected. And in those days, it was highly unusual for 2 from the same annual conference to be elected in the same jurisdictional conference. By the way, Alfred is a Boston University School of Theology graduate. As I then had 2 days before the consecration as bishop took place, and it's similar to a process that some of you have experienced and others of you are anticipating. Hands are laid on me, and the words, take thou authority are said. That's awesome. And I wasn't sure I was ready for that authority. And I've heard authority referred to today, but I want to approach that as a critical issue from a variety of perspectives, perhaps. When that was spoken in the consecration or in ordination, that is a conferring of a formal authority. Myung-Myun referred to the Tsitsi, Reverend Tsitsi Moya this morning, referred to the fact that she, ordained elder, had that authority, but was not perceived by the congregation as being able to exercise it. I don't know whether that's as true for men or not, but from observing men in some other situations, I think many times we have an elected, an appointed, assigned position with a name, a title, that expects a certain authority. But unless there is trust built, the informal authority that comes with trust is what makes the difference. And if there is a break in trust, the person with the formal authority will no longer be able to function effectively. A colleague of mine used to say, does that make sense? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes. So the formal authority is important to claim, as I was hearing from my colleagues, but recognizing the informal authority rooted in trust is so important. I thought of the first church I served, where Maud, a retired educator, was the matriarch. This was a small congregation. And what Maud said, whether it was in the parking lot or the kitchen, made a difference. So I knew I had to develop a relationship with Maud. In some churches it would be a patriarch. Pastors, leaders of nonprofits, even seminaries, need informal authority as well as formal authority. Some of you know the work of Ronald Heifetz from across the river. What's the river, that direction? Kennedy School of Government, I think his book, Leadership Without Easy Answers. Heifetz talks a lot about formal authority and informal authority. And he even says that sometimes formal authority gets in the way of effective leadership, and that the authority can come from the margins, the edges of an organization. And the part of a leader then is to make the space for those wonderful voices at the edges to be heard and to come into the center, not making the direct actions oneself. Heifetz defines leadership not positionally, but as an activity. And he says that leaders are to mobilize people to do something socially useful, help people to address conflicts in the values they hold, diminish the gap between the values people stand for and the realities they face, and you may not like this last one, orchestrate conflicts. There are times in a stagnant organization when a leader needs to bring the differences to the table so that a group can name them, work through them, and move forward. For many, that is counterintuitive, but so essential. Orchestrate conflicts, but then keep them within a reasonable level, not a high intensity. That's another whole subject. So Heifetz does not equate leadership and authority. He suggests that authority, as I said, can be a hindrance to a leadership. And you've heard the term conferred power. He says conferred power can be given and it can be taken away. Heifetz has obviously influenced me. Another person who's influenced me is Sally Helgeson, a consultant and educator with secular, both profit and nonprofit organizations. And she uses the metaphor of the web of inclusion. Can you picture that spider web on a balcony or a porch where there's a center and from it goes out the various strands? It's somewhat flexible, but yet there is a pattern to it. That's the way she suggests that late 20th, 21st century organizations need to be involved. It's more of a postmodern, systemic, growing out of the Margaret Wheatley kind of understanding. And Helgeson believes that the role of the leader is to be in that center of that web, asking the right questions. The questions are so important in helping an organization to move forward. And asking everybody, not just those in official leadership, but the unofficial, having the conversations go across that whole web of inclusion. The leader's desire then is to build relationships and to create an environment where it's not we, they, but we together. You also heard reference to that earlier. The web is a non-hierarchical structure where every voice is valued, and the information keeps flowing. Static organizations, the information is held in one place. Vibrant organizations, the information keeps flowing, not secretly held. And the web builds from the center to the edges, and the leader holds the center through a focus on values and vision, and helping the organization to keep looking at that and then get flexibly moved out. This understanding of web of inclusion was particularly important for me during the 4 years I was the interim bishop for the Albany Episcopal area. In that setting, I had formal leadership of two relatively small geographical entities, annual conferences. Soon after I arrived, it became apparent that those two were involved with dialogues with two other northern and western New York annual conferences. Some people here know vitally about this. And that they were served by another bishop. All of us knew that there would be one less bishop in the northeastern jurisdiction of the United Methodist Church. So building networks of relationships was essential to any discernment of how that reduction would happen, the decision making. Well, within 2 years, those 4 judicatories were involved with 2 other Episcopal areas, one of which was served by Jane Middleton, and the other of which was New England and involved some of you. So there were 6 annual conferences, eventually involved in developing relationships about both critical matters like camps and pensions and appointments, a whole mass of relationships kinds of issues. Eventually out of that, there came 3 annual conferences, my 2 splitting along state lines and going in with new ones. A very complex change process that I understood that the one who connected with all of those, I was like that, building that web of relationships in different directions. But out of my prayer during that time, I also developed another metaphor that may seem an unusual metaphor for leadership. And that was midwife.
Yeah.
I hear some yes. I was listening to and helping others, coaching at times, teaching, developing different relationships, at times encouraging people to relax and breathe. God's with us, it will be okay. And creating boundaries where things might not be appropriate, because that's really critical, keeping the safety zones of not getting things out of bounds. But I knew that after that, birthing was accomplished. July 1st, 2010, the babies would grow up and I could go on and watch them. So I invite that as another metaphor of leadership, the midwife process. And I suspect enough men are able these days to watch birthing that they can understand that coaching metaphor also. Well, inherent in what is said about this is assumptions about power, and that's been referred to. Mary Elizabeth, 2 minutes.
You can take as long as you want. I'm just giving you this as a gift.
Is this negotiation?
Just a few brief words about power. The word power has been referred to a lot of times today. It comes from the Latin word P-O-S-S-E. It's the same word which is the English word possibility. The Latin word means to be able to. So when I understand power, it's what is the possibility? What can happen? What is able to be done? Martha Ellen Stortz, a Lutheran seminary professor, has a wonderful book, Pastor Power, and she suggests that there are 3 concepts of power that I won't get into. You've heard some of them today, that it's a commodity to be possessed, a capacity to create something. But her third definition of power is relationship. And relationship is a circulating power. It involves interactions with persons, within institutions, and so I really resonate with that one. And I won't go into...
Seriously, take as long as you want.
That's dangerous.
Oh, go for it, Susan. That's dangerous.
Seize your power.
Okay, I will. Just several characteristics of that understanding of power as possibility. The first is listening. For the leader to be listening in multiple levels. And for me, the first is one thing you've heard periodically today. Listen to God, the divine, however you define that. Where is God in the midst of this situation? With me, with others. And the second is listening to myself. You've also heard that today a number of times. How well do I know myself? What gifts do I bring to this situation? Where am I lacking and need to draw on the resources of others? And the third, listening to others. And as I've indicated, not the usual voices. Make sure you hear all types of voices across all kinds of lines. And part of that listening to the voices of others is also helping the others to listen to each other so that web keeps joining, keeps growing. Part of listening, I have found, means that the leader needs to retreat from time to time. Heifetz talks about that as getting up on the balcony and having a balcony view. When you're down on the factory floor or the dance floor, you're participating and you can't see all the patterns, but that time of escape, of retreat, is that engagement of looking at what's happening elsewhere and then being able to share back what you've seen in a way that connects with those in your area. For me, this balcony view means that I have regularly engaged a coach. I also would not be without a spiritual director. And for a time in my early years, I was part of groups that were my spiritual companions. One of those persons from Eastern Pennsylvania is here today. And at least once a year, spending 8 days in silence with God and conversation with my director. Stortz talks about power over, power within, power with. You've heard of those. I'd like to add one other, and I've heard some hints at that today, and that is power that is given away. And I want to use it particularly in terms of multicultural, interethnic situations. In my time in Eastern Pennsylvania and work with Dodie Mathias, I became very much aware of my white privilege and power. And what I learned from Dodie and from our community was that I, as a white person, needed to give away power, be accountable to persons of color in exploring matters. racism impacts us in so many levels, communities, institutions, everywhere. We've heard implications of that. That opening up of that issue of dismantling racism became part of my understanding of what it means to be a leader in at that point, the 20th century. So in New England, a group gathered that included both persons of color and whites, where our task was to explore what it meant to dismantle our systemic racism and look at the internalized oppression experienced by persons of color, so that we were constantly learning from each other, and I found that group to be absolutely valuable for my leadership. In the cabinet at that time, at the end of every meeting, we asked monitoring questions about whose was the mission, where was the power, some of those questions that helped us to reflect on that. There were times when I would find a person of color outside the situation with whom I could consult. I knew that the buck stopped with me. I had to make the decision, but I wanted to listen to the perspective of a person of color in order to be accountable in that setting. So in addition to power with, power within, power over, I invite you to consider power given away for the sake of all. So, more power to you.
Wow. These folks are wonderful, and I'm not going to ask any questions because I want to leave space for you to ask questions. We're going to work with the microphones here on the table. So if you're in the back and you can't hear, would you please just holler out, raise your hand or something like that. So I invite you to raise short questions or make brief comments so that we can hear it from as many of you as we can. Then I might ask my questions after all. My first question begins with God, and you've all referred to that yourselves, so you've sort of set the stage for this one. But from where do you draw living waters? The text in the worship today was the woman at the well and asking of Jesus, give me some of that living water. From where do you draw living water? You've named a few things. You may want to elaborate on something you've named or add something else.
Two things immediately pop to mind, or actually three, obviously scripture hymns. One of the things I know about myself is if I'm really, really paying attention to God, I will wake up in the morning with a hymn in my mind. I'll be singing it. And when I'm not paying attention to God, I don't hear the hymns. And I don't sing them. The other place for spiritual renewal for me is getting outside, paying attention to the created order, paying attention to the marvelous creation that God has given. It means watching Cosmos on Sunday night, that amazing new show that deals with the whole created order and what science is teaching us. Those would be my quick answers.
For quite a few years, I've worked with a spiritual director, which has been a wonderful place of companionship. I've taken, I don't do the 8-day, but I do a 1-week silent retreat in the summers. And I too find joy in God's creation, just simply basking in God's creation. And I remember some years ago in a conversation with my spiritual directors who said to me, you talk about how important that is to you. When's the last time you were even out in nature? Not as a challenge, but as a companion. And I realized that was a good comment. And then just a lot of, I get by with a whole lot of help from my friends.
Amen to all that's been said, because all of those are very important to me. Daily time of silence and prayer is, if I don't do that, I feel it. Physical exercise, right now I'm dealing with some things that prevent me, but I like to walk 2 miles a day at least 5-6 times a week. And that gives breathing room, and sometimes God speaks in those walking moments. Stories of people of the past. Harriet Tubman was mentioned earlier today by somebody. In worship. Was that? Yeah. Luttrell. In the common prayer liturgy for ordinary radicals, she's highlighted today. I don't know if this is her day of death or what. But I've followed the Harriet Tubman Trail on the eastern shore of Maryland in summer of 2012, and then up in Albany area, actually west of Albany, in 2013. And that she is a remarkable woman who had seizures because she was hit by an overseer throwing, in a little country store, throwing a country weight, a weight for the store, trying to get a runaway slave and hitting her. And then she had a vision, and out of that, she began to free the slaves. Stories like that, just, and many others, but she's one that's really on my mind lately. God was driving that vision of hers. What courage. She carried a gun, and her gun was to keep the slaves from going back. I'm not sure I'm ready to carry a gun.
Actually, that kind of opens the door for my next question, and it's an invitation for you to share something about one of the messier experiences of leadership in your life. Maybe a time when you were faced with extreme loneliness, or when you were being blamed for something you had not done, or you were being blamed for something you had done, or you were faced with a situation that required you to act, but in which no action was going to be without negative consequences. So I'm inviting you, I'm taking enough time you can think about this, but I'm inviting you to share an experience, not divulging confidences, of course, and what you learned from it.
I was appointed as the senior pastor head of staff with an associate who was male in a church that had never had a woman. And I think what I had to learn then was something I didn't catch on to in the beginning. My favorite leadership style is collaborative. There are times I know that I can't operate out of that, but that's my ideal, when all of us together find our way forward. And I made the mistake of entering that church from the get-go as a collaborator. And it was a church that was among several described by Lyle Schaller as a church in an area where the dominant mindset was a critical managerial mindset. And when I read that description, I thought, oh yeah, I know this church, and the others in this community were described in the same way. This was a church filled with people who wanted a strong leader. And so I had to call in a consultant and reconnoiter and claim the authority that, had I started at the beginning, it could have been a very different experience. As it was, we lived together well for 8 years, but I had to really backtrack, redefine myself as their leader, and reclaim myself as their leader with God's help.
during the tenure that of 13 years as the head of the General Board of Discipleship, we went from 226 staff to 156 because of budgetary cutbacks and the need to change the way the organization was functioning. I had to sign every one of those release papers. And you know, the nights when you are dealing with people's lives and you have eyes looking back at you for salary and family support and all of that weighs heavy. And in the middle of the night, I would wake up and try to figure out any way forward short of having to do that. What saved me in terms of being able to actually make those decisions over the course of 13 years, and at one time actually closing 20-something jobs at one time, was having a very trusted colleague from outside the church to talk to about how do you survive as a leader when you have to do that. And so one of the learnings that I had from those experiences was that while there are grand and fabulous mentors, guides, wisdom bearers, and all of those things who function within the church, having an external, a person not associated with the church is absolutely essential, because they can help me see things I cannot see. They can help me ask questions that I would never think to ask, and when you're in the midst of the system of an organization, you can't know what you can't see. And so one of the primary learnings through that whole those situations was having a trusted colleague who would absolutely tell me the truth and help me think of every angle in order to make the decision.
I've thought of many. I guess one I would name, a pastor in one conference, highly respected white pastor. There were questions about financial accountability in the congregation, and eventually questions about treatment of and taking over some inappropriately leadership of the daycare and nursery center, and power over the women, relatively poor women, some of them women of color. And to bring this person to accountability was a challenge. To do it, first of all, to make sure which voices to listen to, and that's when I brought in an outside team, a person of color and a white person, to do interviewing and to give me a report of what seemed to be happening, working closely with the district superintendent, seeking advice from the superintendent, but there was no way it wasn't going to be messy.
We have two questions from the floor, and I suggest that we hear both of those questions, give you a chance to respond, and then we'll close. Ty?
So there's this colloquial saying, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I was just wondering, and you kind of touched on some of this, but wondering if you could speak to some of the challenges, accusations, run-ins with that saying and your decision making about certain hardships or particular challenges, or accusations from the community that there's this run-in with power and seen in this light. So, thank you.
Okay. So my question, you've all touched on it a little bit that I've been trying to formulate, is in terms of conferred authority, what you all kind of do with this question of what's seen as respectable and what kind of skills you need to have to kind of navigate certain power structures. I'm curious if someone could elaborate a bit more on what you do with conferred authority when you find you have reason to question it.
In relationship to the first question, power corrupting, absolutely. And I would say that the leaders over the years that I've watched who have really taught me a lot are people who are in places of authority and leadership who have resisted the urge to go it alone. The people that have isolated and insulated themselves from the people with whom they work or the larger community are the people who are most corrupted by power. And so I really have spent some time thinking about this because I didn't want to be that kind of person. And so one of the things that I regularly did was make sure that I knew the life stories of the staff who were in the lowest level positions of roles and responsibilities in the organization, and had very excellent relationships with them, and they would tell me the truth. One of the things that is true about leadership is that people don't, negative news does not float upward. And a leader has to find ways to hear it. And the only way I knew to do that was to find the people who would trust me enough to tell me the truth about how the organization was going. And they would tell me what was working and what wasn't working. And in that sense, I learned a lot about how to avoid the trap of insulation and isolation.
I think that what Karen has just said is very well said, that that it's important to keep the focus on collaboration and to be as open and transparent as possible, and to really have some people who will tell you the way it is. I did have this incident. We had cabinet meetings at a retreat center, and so we went out to play basketball. Now that was pretty much a joke where I'm concerned anyway. I hadn't even had a basketball in my hand in ages. So we started playing a game called horse, which you probably know horse. You know, somebody makes a shot and then you try to do the same shot, and so we're playing horse, and of course immediately I'm out. I haven't made any of the shots and I'm out. I've reached HORSE. So then we had a little bit time left, so we said, well, let's play pig. So we started playing pig. So somebody would make a hook shot and I would make a hook shot and somebody else would make it and so forth. And we're supposed to be calling out our letters when we miss the shot. And I suddenly realized, I'm still in this game. This is amazing. I can't make shots at all, but I'm still in the game. And then I realized I hadn't been calling my letters, and nobody told me that. And when I said it, somebody said, "Oh yeah, you're already at piggy." But that gave me a lot of pause about why did my DSs not tell me that I'm not doing the right thing, and it's only a game. And in conversation with them, they were just trying to not embarrass me, I think. But I needed to be embarrassed. And so to develop that level of trust that people can give you the bad news. The bad news is terribly important, and you need to hear it.
I don't have anything to add on the power corrupts, because I think you did a good job. Jessica, I'm not sure I got your question.
I didn't either.
My question was,
Stand up.
how do you navigate conferred authority when you find you may have reason to question it, and what kind of is your thought process when you're in those situations?
You might want to repeat it because some people in the back probably didn't hear it.
How do you navigate conferred authority when you're uncomfortable with it?
Or you're not quite sure what or you find you may have reason to question it, or how do you navigate that?
I don't. You can nod if I'm getting close. When I went into the leadership of the General Board of Discipleship, I was elected to that position, and suddenly I realized that I didn't know some things that I needed to know. The authority had been conferred, and actually this actually happened before when I made Associate General Secretary a number of years previous. I didn't know everything I needed to know about what conferred authority meant. And so I began to explore what were the places, what was making me nervous about that. And I can remember making a list of the things that I believed went with the job that had been given to me. And then I talked to some people to discover what were other things on the list that I needed to know about. And I systematically went to work on learning what I didn't know in order to take on the mantle of conferred authority. So what did that practically mean? I went back to school and learned how to read a balance sheet, how to build a budget, how to lead the business side of the organization. I had a seminary education. I have a bachelor's degree in seminary education and a master's of theology, and I had a bachelor's degree in education. I'd never learned the business side of anything. I didn't know the business side of anything. What I discovered was if I were going to lead in the organization, I had to know as much about the business side of that organization as I did about the theological side, the philosophical side, the education, etc. side. And so what scared me most was not being able to live in that world, a world where, in fact, a lot of men live and who banter that language around all the time. I needed to learn what is legal in terms of federal law, state law, performance of staff and how you lead and manage staff, what you can do and what you can't do with leadership of staff. Very quickly, how you actually, what are the questions you can ask in an interview and what questions you can't ask in an interview. So I became best buddies with a lawyer. To learn that whole side of stuff that is never taught in seminary and in my experience had never been taught in previous educational settings.
Yeah, part of my instinct, Jessica, is to ask you what you have in mind, because I think what came to mind was part of when I talked about the dismantling racism, giving away power, consulting with persons of color in order to gain a perspective, and as persons to whom I would be accountable for my decision making. I also thought there have been times in my life when I was a consultant in Eastern Pennsylvania, when I was ready to give up my ordination credentials because I thought I might be able to do more good as a layperson. And Bishop Susan Morrison talked me out of it.
Good. Good for her.
Probably the most significant arena of conferred authority for me was being a bishop. And I had just such a clear sense from a significant dream, a lot of discernment, and ultimately the election by the jurisdictional conference that I was called to this work. But when I sat at the desk, and day by day issues would come across my desk that I felt inadequate to deal with, I reached out to others. And so I think that I'm thinking particularly very complex complaints that would come, and but not only that, but let me just refer to that. I had people I could call who would walk me through. It was almost like they were at my elbow, guiding me through each step of the way. And so I leaned on others to do that. That followed a lot and was included along the way with a whole lot of prayer and discernment. The other arena that seems overwhelming is appointment making, when ultimately the bishop says that person will go to this place, which means churches are changed, families are changed, life trajectory is changed. And my experience there was prayer and a great deal of discernment. And in the whole appointment-making process, we paused frequently for prayer as we worked as a cabinet with superintendents. And that's the only way you can do it. And even then, it's an incredibly humbling experience.
Our time is up. Our time is up, but I'd like to say thank you to Kai and Jessica for really good questions. This room is filled with awesome leaders. But today we take a moment to say thank you to these three awesome leaders, Karen, Jane, and Susan. People who have lived extraordinarily well with conferred leadership, but people who live out of yourselves as Karen, Jane, and Susan. Thank you very, very much.
Wow. I still need time to chew, and I believe you do too. But we are actually a little bit late for our closing, and our worship leader is here now. Actually, worship leaders are here, and we are going to have a worship right after, and then I will make a special announcement as soon as we finish the worship.
I need everybody to stand up, please. I need everybody to stretch up. We have been stretching up into some new ideas today. Stretch up, stretch out. We've made some new friends in this circle. So if they look like the touchy kind, give them a hug, give them a stretch. And then stretch inward and down deep. And I have a method here. Now, somebody, one of you, pick that piece of paper up that's under those flowers. Not every table, but a lot of tables have a piece of paper with the flowers. It's kind of like Superwoman. Is there? Okay, yes, there is. Now, if you picked up that piece of paper and there's some green highlight on your paper, I'm going to ask you to remain standing. And if you're done with the quick stretch, everyone else can sit down.
Okay, you remain standing. Yes.
My name is Robin.
Please do not be blocking.
Can you hear me? It's hard to tell.
That's not it. No.
I'm tall. My name is Robin Olson, and I have the delight of being the spiritual life coordinator at the School of Theology. And I also have the delight of gathering us for just a few moments in worship. And we're going to begin with this responsive reading of Psalm 18. And our whole community will recite in unison when it's bold. And the other verses will be voices of our community around the room. Shall we be together in worship? How I love you, God, my strength, my rock, my fortress, my champion.
You are the rock where I take refuge, my shield, my sure defender, my stronghold, and my shelter.
In the anguish of my heart, O God, I called to you for help. From your sanctuary, you heard my voice. My cry came to your ears.
You reached down from the heights and took hold of me, O God. You drew me from the floodwaters, from all that overpowered me.
You brought me into a broad land. You saved me because you loved me.
You will make my lamp burn bright, O God. You will lighten my darkness.
With you I can break through any barrier. With your help I can scale any wall.
How perfect strength, making the path safe for me.
You have given me a shield of salvation that upheld me and trained me with care. You have given me freedom for my steps. My feet have never slipped.
God lives, blessed be my rock. Praise to you, my God and Savior. I will praise you among the nations. I will sing praises to your name.
And we are going to sing praises to God's name. And I would like everyone to stand. And in your packet is the song for everyone born. And this has become quite an anthem of the School of Theology. We proclaim the message of this song. And if you really know this song and love it, come on up and be our music leaders as well. With Chris Simon and Lambert drumming. And if you want to come up and be part of our leadership singing too, please come.
All right. Well, let's join in uplifted voices in this song. For everyone born, a place at the table. For everyone born, clean water and bread. A shelter, a space, a safe place for growing. For everyone born, a star overhead. And God and joy, compassion and peace. Yes, God will delight when we are creators of justice, justice and joy. For woman and man, a place at the table, revising the roles, deciding the share, with wisdom and grace, dividing the power. For woman and man, a system that's fair. And God will delight when we are creators of justice and joy. Justice and joy, for young and for old, a place at the table, a voice to be heard, a part in the song, the hands of the child in hands that are wrinkled, for young and for old, the right. And God will delight when we are creators of justice and joy, compassion and peace. Yes, God will delight when we are creators of justice, justice and joy. For just and unjust, a place at the table, a pleaser of youth, with me to forgive. In anger and hurt, a mindset of mercy. For just and unjust, a new way to live. And God will delight when we are creators of justice and joy, compassion and peace. Yes, God will delight when we are creators of justice, justice and joy. Let's sing this last verse like we mean it. For everyone born, a place at the table, to live without fear and simply to be, to work to speak out, to work to speak
join me in prayer? And please be seated on the microphone.
There's a microphone turned wrong way.
Let's be in prayer together. Oh, gracious and wondrous and beautiful God, we give you thanks that you call us so often to be the ones to set the table. And it is such a joy for us to set the table that is inclusive, that is full of place for all of your peoples. We give you thanks for this banquet you prepare for us of justice and joy and love and generativity. You quench our thirst and you satisfy our deepest hunger, and yet we come back again and again at this banquet that you prepare for us. We celebrate the treasures of this day. We give you thanks, oh God, for the organizers of this conference, for the board members and leaders of the Anna Howard Shaw Center, those current and those founding who are present this day. We give you thanks for all of our presenters, for the truth that they have spoken and the epiphanies that they have kindled in our own lives. We give you thanks for our friends made around the circle of tables. And we give you thanks for our companion in faith, our sister, Anna Howard Shaw. We give you thanks for Anna Snowden Oliver. We give you thanks for those wise pioneers who have come before us. This day we remember with great thanks your vision of Ubuntu, and ask that you create us to be open and available to others, that grace might meet power. This has been a day where we have remembered to lament, and we have said that often there is a maze of power dynamics that we must walk through each day. We've given thanks that your power is manifest in silence sometimes, where our dignity and integrity might be manifest. And with our friend, the sister at the well, we paused and celebrated that there is a yearning in all of us for deep belonging. And at your well, when we are called by name and called in truth, we leave in bold witness. And we are brave to become leaders once we discover the living Christ nourishing our lives. And then we are bold to stand tall, not to shrink in deference, but to become all that we might become. And we give you thanks that your love is a mighty fortress, a bulwark of strength that guides our steps from table to podium and emboldens us to speak, that guides our steps, propels our steps into pulpits, giving us words of mercy and challenge for your people. Oh God, some of us have made history and done things for the first time. Some of us are beautifully aware of our privilege and our responsibility to speak out and raise hands. And all of us, each one of us, God, is grateful for your divine image engraved within our hearts, gifting us uniquely. And even as we remember our sister Gesa, who was unable to be here, as she is gestating your promises, we know at this very moment that you are knitting her beautiful baby together in her womb, as you have knit all of us together in your womb. And finally, as we turn to the next part of our evening, some of us to go home for travel, some of us to go to the library to study, some of us to stay here to celebrate our sister Susan. We are so thankful that you have helped our paths to cross path with this sister who is lavishly graced with tenacity and humility. Oh God, that's an unusual combination. And we give you thanks for our sister Susan. May our circles expand far beyond this place, and may we take this passion, kindled anew, rekindled and ignited for justice. May we bust out of this campus and share that love in this world. And all of God's people together said, Amen. Will you stand and let's bless each other in benediction and printed here on your bulletin. This fourfold Franciscan blessing. Let's say this in unison. May God bless us with this comfort and these answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that we may live deep within our hearts. May God bless us with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people, so that we may work for justice, freedom, and peace. May God bless us with tears to shed for those who suffer from pain, rejection, hunger, and war, so that we may reach out our hands to comfort them and turn their pain into joy. And may God bless us with enough foolishness to believe that we can make a difference in this world, so that we can do what others claim cannot be done. Go in peace and joy. Amen.